Alrighty, class. I want to continue on with our discussion for entry procedures. Now, once we get to subparagraph E under the 1203 or general requirements, that's when we start talking about alternate entry procedures. This is the third type of permit required, or I should say confined space. It's not quite a non-permit space, and it's not quite a permit required space. When you read through the language of it, and I'm going to try to keep this very brief because there's a lot of discussion around this, and also there's just a lot of verbiage in this general requirements paragraph. But when we think about it, the alternate entry procedure is essentially allowing a person to go in to a permit required or into a confined space unaided by him or herself. Um, it's kind of confusing. It's kind of a gray area. A lot of entry employers don't even use this procedure because it's a higher risk. But usually, when it's a one-man operation or one-woman operation, a person or an organization can decide that they want to use alternate entry procedures. So, reading this first one, when you say, an employer whose employees enter a permit space need not comply with the requirements in paragraphs 1204 through 06, which is essentially 04 is the permit program, permitting process, and the entry permit itself. And then 1208 through 1211 are the duties of the entrant, attendant, entry supervisor, and then also 1211 being rescue procedures. So what that essentially says is a person can go in without a permit and also uh, by him or herself without any rescue service present. Again, very gray area. As we continue on, you'll see this is kind of typically what you would expect with an alternate entry. The person's not tied to a retrieval device. They're going to have ventilation. They're still going to have to post signs. Still going to have to barricade. But that individual, if there's a ladder or access of some sort, they can typically go in under, without a retrieval device. Now, the only hazard that is allowed in an alternate entry is an actual or potential hazardous atmosphere. Now, obviously, if it's an actual atmosphere or hazardous atmosphere, then you'd have to use ventilation in order to remove that hazard. If you cannot, of course, then it becomes a permit required confined space. However, if you can control that atmosphere with continuous forced air ventilation, then you could technically classify this as an alternate entry and proceed under these procedures. However, if there's any other danger that cannot be controlled, say an engulfment or a configuration or one of those wild card hazards like electrocution, high pressure, steam, high temperature, things of that nature, then it could no longer be an alternate entry. It would have to be upgraded to a full permit required confined space entry. Now, some of these subsequent paragraphs, they're kind of a regurgitation of the requirements as it stands with a permit required space. You're going to need ventilation, obviously, continuous throughout the entire duration of the entry. Of course, if you have to make an initial entry in order to classify as alternate entry, then you'd have to go by the standard under the paragraphs 1204 through 1211, meaning a permit, having an entrant, attendant, entry supervisor, the whole kit and caboodle. So, in my opinion, in most cases, if you have to make an entry, it's going to have to be a permit required entry in that space. If you can classify from outside the space, then perfect, and maybe you can still do an alternate entry. Some other key notes, and I'll let you guys read on the course slide, but any conditions making it unsafe to remove an entrance cover must be eliminated before that cover is removed. Now, this is almost common sense across the board with any kind of confined space. And what that means, essentially, is that if you can test from outside of the space and remove or reduce the risk of a hazard once an employee opens the confined space, then obviously do so. Of course, no hazardous atmosphere is permitted within the space. I kind of covered that briefly. If it is, then of course it's a permit required confined space. Forced air ventilation must be directed to ventilate the immediate areas where employees or employee is or will be present within the space, and then must be from a clean source. So some just housekeeping items. The space must be continuously monitored. In my opinion, continuous monitoring where the entrant or the individual wears the monitor on him or herself is just like a no-brainer. The standard allows periodic monitoring in some cases, but you really leave yourself exposed to additional liability if you choose to do periodic monitoring, which in my experience is just easier. If you don't have a monitor, you can always rent them. It's kind of hard to justify not having a monitor on site. Now, ensuring a safe method of entering and exiting the space, this goes across the board. If a hoisting system is used, it has to be approved by a PE, meaning it has to be manufactured, typically. And so this meaning, you can't use a gantry crane or some other type of hoisting device. It has to be designed for personnel hoisting. However, we're still under subparagraph E, which is alternate entry. So in a lot of cases, if you have an access ladder or the rungs within a manhole or a structure that are viable for entry and exit, and the entrant can enter using those, then by all means do so. But if there is a risk, for a hazard, then potentially you might want to upgrade to using some sort of retrieval device. This would be an example of a narrow silhouette manhole ladder. And then also just your standard rungs within the structure itself, as long as they are adequate. Let me see. And I think a lot of this other information is kind of almost common sense. I think, let me see. Yep, we already passed subparagraph F and G, but with alternate entry, just understand the only hazard that is allowable is either an actual or a potential atmospheric hazard. That's really the delineating characteristic between an alternate entry and a permit required confined space entry.